Hey guys, so there's just something about the fall. It makes me want to read two types of books. It makes me want to read all the classics and all the fantasy. And so we're going to be focusing on that kind of in the next month a little bit. Today, if you read the title of this video, you're smarter than I am because I'm not sure what I'm going to title it yet. But I'm going to be sharing some of my favorite classic books, kind of like all-time favorite. A lot of them are new favorites, and sharing some tips on reading classic literature because it's something that I've come to really enjoy in the last couple of years. I did a similar video 2 years ago sharing, I think it was just a few different tips and some good beginner classics, I think is what I named it. And since then I've read more, I've loved more, I have more I want to share, and I just want to continue growing in my reading, my knowledge, especially with classics and stuff. A lot of them are classics for a reason, some of them maybe shouldn't be. And I'm currently working on like this side personal project to create a kind of like a university literature curriculum for myself. I minored in English in university, but that actually means I only had to take one course because I did some random stuff with my university degree. I only took one English course, and it was 6 weeks long in the summer, about 6 months after we got married, newlywed, working full-time and doing photography business on the side. And then I had this, what was considered a full-time university load as well, and we had to read 12 full-length novels in this 6-week period. And so that was my like really only English exposure in university, and I feel like it was a complete failure. But that being said, I was in university to check a box, to get a piece of paper, to be able to teach children, and I wasn't there to learn, which those are very different things, I've come to realize. And now in this stage of my life, I really want to learn, so I'm working on that. Once I kind of have it figured out, I think I'm going to share it here if it makes any sense. But today we're going to talk about some of my favorite classics I've read in the last while, as well as just some like tips if you are a little daunted by classics, because I was definitely in that boat. And my first tip I think will probably be helpful for anyone on here, and is kind of like not even a real tip, it's a sub tip, a pre-tip, because that is just that reading other books like fiction, non-fiction, etc. will help you in your classic reading. Like, they kind of are different muscles, but at the same time, the more you exercise the fiction and like general fiction and nonfiction reading, that will help you reading classics as well. You still have to work on the classics muscle separately, but it does help. So that's like a pre-tip. Okay, tip number one, and I know I shared this in my video a couple of years ago, is to start with shorter classics. Now, don't just assume because a book is shorter, it's going to be easier to read. But if it is shorter and it is a hard book to read, I mean, it's over sooner. So there's that. But I want to share two and a half of my favorite short classics that are super easy to read. The first one, if you've been watching my videos since like April-ish, I've been raving about this book almost every single month. That is Daddy Longlegs. So this is a novel written in verse about a girl named Jerusha, who goes by Judy. She starts out in an orphanage. She gets kind of like sponsored to go to college. There's this like all these cool illustrations I'm trying to find here. But the only stipulation by this guy who is sponsoring her to go to college is that she has to write him every month, and she can't know who he is. So she writes him these letters, which is what this entire book is. And she often sends these like funny little illustrations just to go with her letters, which it just adds to it. I guess I should have said too, my definition I'm using for a classic here is anything written over 100 years ago or 100 plus years ago. And this one was written, I think, in 1912, and it, minus like the lack of technology, but it feels like it could have just been written a couple years ago. And then there is this is why this is 2.5. There's a second book kind of in the series called Dear Enemy, where we follow Judy's friend. She becomes the supervisor or superintendent or something of the orphanage where Judy grew up, and she's writing letters to Judy. And that one was really good too. I do have issues where I really like physical books. I read that one via ebook and it brought down my enjoyment level. But if you can be unlike me and enjoy reading on some kind of device. Most classics, because they're in the public domain, you can get them for free online, so there's that benefit. But if you're like me and you like the physical book, they can be cheap to find too. So this one is a short classic. I also really enjoyed The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This one is a short story about a governess who goes to work for this family, and these kids, they seem to be seeing things, and it's kind of got like those gothic vibes, which I personally really enjoy when an author can kind of creep me out just by their writing. It's not like overly creepy, but considering when this was written, which I actually don't know when it was, possibly 1898. Yes, it was first serialized in 1898. I think it's pretty creepy for that. So those are 2.5 classics, 3 really, that are super short and are a really easy way to like dip your toe in or check some classic books off of your list, but in a really accessible and quick way. My next tip totally plays off of this, and that is to read some children's classics. They also are often shorter, plus they were written for children, so they're probably going to be easier to read. This is not always the case. But also, if you've been here the last few months, one that I keep raving about is What Katie Did. This was written in 1872. And we follow a girl named Katie who is a little obnoxious at the beginning, but something happens in her life and her like trajectory changes. She starts out as a 12-year-old, just totally self-centered, and then things change. And this one was one of those ones where I was just like, how was this not written a few years ago? It was so easy to read, but it was written over like 150 years ago almost already. Yeah, that's 150. I can do math. Crazy. So I really enjoyed this one. And then a favorite of mine, because I grew up watching the 1994, I think it was, film of A Little Princess. And let me just say, I'm not a Shirley Temple fan. I've talked about this before. The 1994 movie is so much better. A Little Princess, oh, and it has a different ending than the book though, so there's that. This is a story about Sarah Crewe. She starts out as a rich girl. She goes to boarding school. Her dad dies and she becomes penniless, and the overlord really of the school that she goes to takes advantage of her and makes her a slave and or a servant. And through it all, she has just this amazing character, and I really admire her for that. So this is another children's classic that's super easy to read. Plus, my friend gifted me this edition, which I just love so much. They're so cute on there. Look at her. She's probably not so cute. That's Miss Minchin. But those are cute. And then my next tip is to read classics in a genre that you like. So growing up, I would definitely say I leaned more towards like mystery, suspense kind of books. So if that was you, or if there's like a different genre, pick a classic in that genre. So I guess 2023 marks the first year of Agatha Christie's books slowly becoming in the public domain. I'm pretty sure it was the first year. So this was like when she first started writing. So now her books are becoming in the public domain / also being considered classics. I decided to completely leave her off this list because most of hers aren't 100 years old yet, and then I could have a whole video just on Agatha Christie, which, I mean, I have a few. But another mystery writer that I really enjoy is Dorothy L. Sayers, and her book Whose Body, I think, also came out, pretty sure I saw, yeah, this was published in 1923, so it is now considered a classic if we want to use the 100-year term to define a classic. And this is just a mystery story of a body found in a bathtub, and also at the same time a man is missing. And we follow Lord Peter Wimsey as he tries to solve this mystery. And so I think there's really something to just sticking with your genre. So like there's classic fantasy, there's classic science fiction, you know, you can find a classic in your genre. Certain ones much easier than others, though, I will say. But that might be a good way to start to dip your toe into classics and just to start learning the language of classics in a genre that you're familiar with or comfortable with. My next tip is something that I hate doing with non-classics, and it took me a long time to realize like this is actually very helpful to do this with classics, and that is to read summaries or watch the movie beforehand slash while you're doing this, while you're reading the book. Because I grew up reading mystery, loving mystery, for me a lot of reading, the enjoyment is uncovering the secrets, figuring out where this story is going to lead. And so reading a summary online kind of seemed like the wrong thing to do because that just spoils it all. But a lot of classics need a little bit of help. They need someone to tell, at least me, what's going on. Or even sometimes I feel like I understand where a story is going, but maybe looking things up will just confirm, okay, yes, I am understanding this correctly. And that can really help. And then also movies, I mean, if you watch them, I watch a couple a year, so I don't watch very many movies, but it can help with classics. My daughter and I did watch one of the Emma adaptations while I was reading that book, and that helped me a bit with the story. My next tip is just to understand that not all of an author's books are created equal. So if you read a Jane Austen and you love it, don't assume you're gonna love all of her books. If you read a Jane Austen and you hate it or don't understand it, don't assume that's gonna be the case for all of her books. I have read, I'm pretty sure, I've now read all of Jane Austen's main works, a couple of them multiple times, and sometimes I flip-flop. Like every time I read Pride and Prejudice, I like it or I don't. Like it changes every single time. Some of her books I really don't like. Some of them, like this one here, I actually really did enjoy. This is Persuasion. Like Pride and Prejudice is her most loved. I think Persuasion for some people is up there. It's definitely not like normally one of the bottom ones, but this has become my favorite Jane Austen. And if I would have given up because I had read a few Jane Austen and not really loved her books, I never would have come across this one, which I really did enjoy. And so don't just write an author off because you read even 1, 2, 3 of their books and you didn't like them, because I'm definitely find more so with classics than books published more recently that is a lot more hit and miss. I feel like maybe publishers were just publishing things without, I don't know, if they didn't have the same standards or what. I feel like now authors are a little bit more consistent generally, and it can be very hit and miss with classics. My next tip is not really a tip at all. I just really wanted to share this book. This isn't a tip. I love Little Women. This is oddly one of the few classics that I read in high school, like by choice, and I understood it and I read it all and I just loved it. And I guess just find some classics that really work for you. And this does lead into my next tip. Some classics, like I think most people would say Little Women is an easy read. But then you'll hear, or you'll either watch a video or you'll see a list where people say, okay, these are easy classics, classics everyone loves. And you'll start reading some of them and you're like, oh, this is way too hard for me. Or you'll see one that is like, oh, this book is really hard to read. Don't read this one when you're just starting out. And then you read it and you're like, actually, I really loved it. And so I have 3 books here that I feel like maybe are a little bit contradictory. Like most people wouldn't say, these are really good classics to start with. And I loved all of these near the beginning of my classic reading journey. Actually, we'll start with the oldest one. So this one I had to read in grade 11 in high school. In my psychology class, I think my teacher just like really wanted people to read it. And that is Pilgrim's Progress. So this is like I think that would probably even be before I read Little Women. Right around the same time actually. But I was not reading classics at all. And we had to read this book and I loved it. And there was probably no point where anyone would have really recommended this book to me based on what I was currently reading. I was reading a lot of mystery, a lot of suspense, a lot of like fly through type books, not sit there and plod through. Like this one takes a lot to go through. But for me, it's a favorite. I love reading Christian's story just because someone says it's a hard book, but if you want to read it, I think don't let that scare you. 2 other books that I feel that way about. Wuthering Heights. This is one of those books where like I honestly, like the storyline I don't enjoy. But I read this book, I think just before I started BookTube, like right in that tiny little space where I was watching BookTube but not making videos yet. And I just remember being so in the environment. She talks a lot about like the wind and the moors and just the cold. And I was reading this in October. It would have been like almost 4 years ago now. And I just felt the chill and the wind, and that just, like, I don't know. I'm scared to reread this book because I'm scared I'm not going to like it. But I loved the atmosphere in this. Even though I wasn't really understanding all of the story, and once I did understand the story, I didn't really like the story, this is still one of my favorite classics because of that atmosphere. And I think if I would have heard things about this beforehand, I probably would have been scared to pick it up, but for some reason I picked it up and it was the right book at the right time. And then the last one on this section is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. So I'd been wanting to read some Elizabeth Gaskell, actually Wives and Daughters, which I hope to finish or start and read by the end of this year. But I got my hands on North and South and I was like, okay, I don't know anything about this. I will read this little book. Well, it's little, but it's thick. And I just didn't want to put this book down. I had no idea going into it what it was about. It's about Marianne that moves from one place in England to another. Of course, I got interrupted by a doorbell, and I don't know how other booktubers do it. They always seem so put together, and I just lose my train of thought. I know I was talking about this book, but I don't know where I was going with that, or what I finished saying. Either way, I enjoyed this one. I don't think it's like her most well-known work, probably not the one people would recommend starting with, etc. But at the time, like, I was putting down more recent fiction books to read this classic. The same thing I was doing with when I was reading Persuasion. Like, I was just into these books, and I don't think they're ones that people would normally recommend. So kind of like another tip is just to read whatever draws you, whatever you feel like reading. Even if someone says, no, like, read that after this book, or I mean, unless there's like a logical reason as for that. I mean, if it's a series, you probably should read it in order. But I think different books work for people at different times. Even these three that I'm saying, like, they hit me at the right time. Like, maybe I loved these books then, but if I read them today, would I love them as much? I don't know. So it's not always like you have to just read classics in a certain order. Okay, so I think that was all for my tips. Like I said, I am working on creating a bit of a literature curriculum for myself. I'm not really sure how that's going to look. Some kind of outline in reading good books. So stay tuned, because I think if I can make it work, I will share a video on that. So if you guys have tips for reading classics, leave them in the comments. And then if you have like a classic that you love, that you feel like you shouldn't based on, you know, your knowledge of classics, your level of reading, etc., I would love to hear it. Like, what classic surprised you that you enjoyed it so much in the time that you read it? Thanks so much for being here, you guys.